A show of solidarity for Ukraine.
You're not alone. You're not alone in this fight. You're not alone in the reconstruction that comes after.
Plus, growing concerns of an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah.
Risk of escalation in the region is acute, and I know that we are all very much focused on that.
Along with multiple crises, U.S. President Joe Biden is using his last months in office to focus on Africa, and the U.S. state of Florida is bracing for a massive hurricane. Today is Thursday, September 26th, and this is VOA's Flashpoint. Hello everyone, I'm Steve Miller in for Lori London and Steve Karish. World leaders have a full plate of issues to contend with this week as they gather for the UN General Assembly. The war in Ukraine, Sudan's humanitarian crisis, and an escalation between Israel and Hezbollah are continuing to dominate this week's meetings in New York. VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir starts things off.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the UN General Assembly on Wednesday that Russia has failed to subjugate Ukraine on the battlefield and is looking for new ways to break his country, including battering its energy infrastructure ahead of winter. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
This is how Putin is preparing for winter, hoping to torment millions of Ukrainians, ordinary families, women, children, ordinary towns, ordinary villages. Putin wants to leave them in the dark and cold this winter, forcing Ukraine to suffer and surrender.
Separately, diplomats on the sidelines of the UN meetings are calling for calm after a wave of Israeli attacks and airstrikes on southern Lebanon and Hezbollah rockets launched at Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke during a meeting of G20 foreign ministers.
In the Middle East, we're intensely engaged with a number of partners to de-escalate tensions in Lebanon and to work to get a ceasefire agreement that would have so many benefits for all concerned.
The UN said nearly 100,000 Lebanese had been displaced this week as they fled intense Israeli airstrikes, mostly in Hezbollah-controlled South Lebanon. Health officials said at least 51 Lebanese were killed and hundreds wounded on Wednesday. Israel said it shot down a Hezbollah missile aimed at Tel Aviv. At France's request, the UN Security Council met in an emergency session late Wednesday. French President Emmanuel Macron.
We must not, we cannot have a war in Lebanon. There cannot be a war in Lebanon. This is why we urge Israel to cease this escalation in Lebanon and for Hezbollah to cease the missile launch to Israel. We urge all of those who provide them with the means to do so to stop doing so.
Meanwhile, in Sudan, a brutal war between rival generals has pushed 26 million people into hunger and famine and displaced at least 10 million people. Nisreen El-Saim is a Sudanese peace activist.
We are all aware of the statistics. But let's remember, these numbers represent individuals, people filled with hopes, dreams, and aspiration. Aspiration for a flourishing, united, democratic Sudan. These numbers are me, my family, and friends.
At a meeting about the situation, the UN said it is trying to meet a massive funding gap for aid, dispersing $25 million from its emergency fund. The European Union announced nearly $77 million, and the U.S. said it is giving an additional $424 million. Linda Thomas-Greenfield is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
We must compel, in fact, insist and demand that the warring parties accept humanitarian pauses in El Fasher, Khartoum, and other highly vulnerable areas to allow aid to flow and civilians to flee.
On Thursday, the General Assembly will hear from General Abdel Fattah el-Burhan one of the protagonists in the Sudanese war. Margaret Bashir, VOA News, the United Nations.
U.S. President Joe Biden hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House on Thursday and used the visit to announce $8 billion in military aid to support its ongoing efforts to fight Russia's continued attacks. And in a strong display of unity for Ukraine, Zelensky stood alongside Biden, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and other world leaders on the sidelines of the General Assembly as they announced the launch of a joint declaration of support for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction.
This war has shown the Ukrainians can do anything they set their minds to. Today, we show the Ukrainians you're not alone. You're not alone in this fight. You're not alone in the reconstruction that comes after. Ukrainian people have fought and died to win a future of freedom and independence. Mr. President, we all stand by your side to help Ukraine make the most of it.
The declaration has support from more than 30 countries, including the group of 7 major democracies. During his address at the United Nations General Assembly, Zelensky reaffirmed his plan for peace.
Any parallel or alternative attempts to seek peace are, in fact, efforts to achieve a lull instead of an end to the war. As a global initiative, the peace formula has already existed for 2 years.
Earlier, Laurie London spoke with Alina Beketova, Democracy Fellow with the Center for European Policy Analysis, for insights on what the future may hold for Ukraine as it prepares to cope with a third winter under attack.
What did you take away from President Zelensky's address to the UN General Assembly? Any major thoughts or things that stood out to you?
Well, I think that the speech was powerful, and my main take is that the President Zelensky has said about the peace formula that it has existed for 2 years, and that basically he understands that this is the main initiative that has to be followed. I also was struck by the number because 80% of Ukraine's energy system is gone and people are preparing for a very intense and hard winter. I speak with people in Ukraine and, they are following Zelensky visit these days because they understand that it influences their, lives and the everyday just conditions because people are preparing for the very tough winter. This is going to be the third tough winter in Ukraine. And I spoke with one of the journalists in Ukraine, she was like, well, at first we were excited. Right now we are in anxiety because we don't know what to expect, but everyone wants, Zelensky to be with positive news after this trip. And everyone understands that it's a very crucial time for Ukraine because of the, upcoming elections in the United States. And it's very important that Zelensky is going to meet with both candidates and the current president. And that is why people have this hope. So we'll see how it will turn out.
What is the most important thing that they feel like Ukraine needs, that Zelensky needs to convey?
So the main thing right now is that people understand that the U.S. is our largest ally, and the country will go through the domestic politics and elections, and that is why people like the U.S. won't be able probably to think about other country like Ukraine. So that is why right now it's a very crucial moment, and people understand it's the moment of urgency. So people in Ukraine are shelled every day. So that is why the main thing is to have all the urgent needs should be more or less fulfilled, which is, of course, I would never think that I would be talking about more weapons for Ukraine, but this is the current moods in Ukraine and they haven't changed. And of course, people are more or less, they want Ukraine to have the sufficient amount of weapons so that they could repel the Russian troops from the territory. And right now, the critical infrastructure is under the danger. So that is why for many people, it's still the main thing that we, like Ukrainians, need more weapons to defend themselves. So that is why it's more or less this sentiment. And of course, people are talking about the long-range weapons, but in these days when not everyone is a military expert, has become a military expert because people think that, the long-range weapons will help Ukraine to, strike in the rear of Russia and get rid of more airfields and places that Russia uses for, launching the missile attacks.
Ukraine obviously will not agree to giving up some of its territory, and Russia seems pretty dug in that it's not going to remove itself. How do they get past that? And where does this war go from here going into 3 years?
But unfortunately, if you remember the fall of 2022, when no one expected Kherson and Kharkiv Oblast were liberated by the Ukrainian defense forces. Then when no one expected the Kursk operation happened. So I believe when Ukrainians have enough of weapons and, means to defend themselves and to actually liberate the territory, they do it because Ukrainians have still a lot of motivation. They defend their land, they defend their territory. It's very hard for me to imagine the situation that, there are negotiations and someone will tell Ukraine, you should just give Russia these territories. It's very hard for me to imagine at this point that Ukrainians will say, okay, we will give it to them.
Would allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to go deeper into Russian territory, would that escalate the war, or do you see it as somehow deterring Russia from continuing?
I think allowing Ukraine to target and strike with long-range weapons is deterring Russia to conduct the war on the territory of Ukraine, because it's not the escalation. The only escalation was here when Russia invaded another country, Ukraine, and it happened 10 years ago. Right now, after the full-scale invasion, we just see the second attempt. So we see that Russia has the same behavior over and over again. This is because of the fear of escalation. But what we're seeing right now, and with the long-range weapons, it will be the deterrence. So this is the deterrence, and production is deterrence. We need the production to be the deterrence, the production of all the military weapons. So then in this case, Russia will understand that they can't take Ukraine. And that will lead them to understand that, okay, we should probably talk. We should probably sit.
Alina Bekatova is a democracy fellow with the Center for European Policy. She was speaking to my colleague, Lori London. And as Anna Chernikova in Kyiv reports, Zelensky's visit also brought a bit of political controversy ahead of the upcoming U.S. presidential election.
Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, demanded on Wednesday that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky fire his ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, over Zelensky's trip to a factory in Pennsylvania at the beginning of the week. He accused Ukraine of election interference. The Ukrainian embassy in Washington has not yet responded. Ukrainian officials did not provide any comments either. In Ukraine, Johnson's claims were received with a glance of sadness and worry that such incidents may create a negative perception of Ukraine in the eyes of the U.S. nation. Meanwhile, Russian troops launched another massive drone and missile attack across Ukraine. Ukrainian air defense said it destroyed 78 drones and all 4 guided Kh-type missiles. It also recorded that 1.5 dozen drones were targeting the capital Kyiv. The air defense was active for more than 5 hours in a row. The strikes damaged at least 4 residential buildings and around 20 vehicles in the capital. No casualties were reported. Later in the morning, Thursday, Russian forces launched at least 3 Kinjal hypersonic missiles targeting the airfield in the Khmelnytska region. No damage or casualties have been reported. All this as Russian forces continue to advance in the Donbas region, getting closer to the city of Vuhledar, which Ukrainian forces have been defending for more than 31 months now. Ukrainian military experts predict that the city may fall to Russian occupation in the upcoming weeks. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
And turning to the Middle East, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will address the UN General Assembly on Friday amid growing pressure from allies, including the United States, for a ceasefire with Hezbollah. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
Risk of escalation in the region is acute, and I know that we are all very much focused on that. The best answer is diplomacy, and our coordinated efforts are vital to preventing further escalation.
Israel's relentless pressure on the Iran-backed militia group in Lebanon, including intense airstrikes and assassinations of some of its senior commanders, have raised concern that a possible ground invasion could lead to a wider war in the region. Lori London also spoke with Linda Gradstein in Jerusalem amid mixed reports that Israel has rejected calls for a ceasefire.
It's hard to tell. Look, there's a press report here that according to various diplomats, he did say that he will back a 21-day Hezbollah truce. And at the same time, Israel just targeted the Hezbollah drone chief in Beirut, which, Hezbollah sees as stepping up the conflict. Israel has not hit Beirut that often and then has hit Beirut 4 times in the last couple of weeks. Now, and in addition, some of the hardliners in Netanyahu's government have said that they will pull out of the government if he does accept a ceasefire. I think it's hard to tell, to be quite honest. So, as of now, there are no negotiations, but perhaps it's something he wants to announce in his UN speech tomorrow. Perhaps it's something that he wants to give a couple of more days for Israel to do more damage to Hezbollah before announcing. Or perhaps Israel really is not interested in any kind of a ceasefire. Israel did call up 2 reserve brigades yesterday, so they're on their way up north, and it carried out a big training exercise yesterday and today. But again, how much of that is posturing, it's really hard to tell.
And fighting is still continuing in Gaza, in the north and the south as well, in the Gaza Strip.
Yes. So Israel says that it's sort of entering a new phase in Gaza, that it will now focus on sort of targeted attacks rather than all-out fighting. But there has been fighting going on. And also it means that Israel has not succeeded in its goal of really making sure that Hamas cannot present a threat to Israel anymore. There are reports that there have been sort of secret negotiations between Hamas and the more moderate Fatah, which runs the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. A couple of Arab newspapers have said that they have agreed on a joint plan to govern Gaza, that this is all very preliminary. And, of course, it's not something that Israel will agree to. Netanyahu has said that he doesn't see any role for Hamas in Gaza at all. So the fighting continues in Gaza, but it's really more focused on the north at this point.
Is it safe to say there's really not at this point any renewed hope for a ceasefire in Gaza there as well?
No, not at all. I mean, but again, what some people are sort of saying is that if there is a 21-day ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and if that fighting stops, then maybe it will lead to a ceasefire in Gaza. I tend to doubt it because there has been a deal on the table now for months, and both Israel and Hamas have added obstacles that have made it almost impossible for there to be a deal in which, either over stages or even in one stage, there would be a ceasefire, the release of all of the hostages, and even thousands of Palestinian prisoners would be freed. And some of the Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, would be allowed to leave Gaza safely. But it doesn't really seem to be moving anywhere. There are also some questions about what's going on with Sinwar. He has not apparently been in contact with the lower level Hezbollah. He has not been in contact with the lower level Hamas officials. And there was some speculation in Israel that perhaps he was wounded or killed. Although my guess is that if that had happened, Israel would be very quick to come out and announce it.
Linda Gradstein coming to us from Jerusalem. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thank you.
You're listening to Flashpoint from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Miller. Beyond the Middle East and Europe, U.S. President Joe Biden is also focusing on Africa in these last few months of his presidency. In the space of one day in front of world leaders, he elevated Sudan's conflict to a priority, announced that he would travel to Angola, and spoke in favor of putting 2 African nations on the UN Security Council. Anita Powell has that story.
President Joe Biden is turning to Africa in the sunset of his presidency. In the space of one day, in front of world leaders, he elevated Sudan's conflict to a priority, announced he would travel to Angola, and endorsed adding 2 seats for African countries to the UN Security Council. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from New York. Blink, and you might have missed it. In his valedictory speech to the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday, President Joe Biden made several brief overtures to the African continent, reminding world leaders of the evils of South Africa's apartheid regime, calling for an end to Sudan's grueling conflict, and citing urgency in combating an Mpox outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But these 2 short lines may have the most weight.
The UN needs to adapt and bring new voices and new perspectives. That's why we support reforming and expanding the membership of the UN Security Council.
For years, African leaders have called for a seat at this table. But critics point out that Washington does not support a critical part of Security Council membership, veto power. Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow in the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says African nations are puzzled by Biden's stance.
So this is really, I think, an unfinished project of his, probably more words than reality, quite frankly. The fact that he has caveated this announcement by saying that Africans shouldn't get the veto when they do, and if they do get permanent seats on the Security Council, frankly, has left Africans scratching their heads.
John Fortier, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, said it matters that Biden used this platform to call for an end to Sudan's raging 17-month conflict, but doubts whether that call will provoke action.
This is one that of conflicts that is serious, but has not been getting world attention. And I think his pointing to it is really to elevate it in world consciousness, but not yet to really know how we're going to see an end to this.
And Biden's announcement that he will visit Angola next month allows him to keep his promise to visit the continent. But again, Hudson wondered how this long-delayed visit will actually land.
Coming as it does at the very tail end of his administration, without much to, I think, really celebrate in terms of his involvement in Africa, I think the visit will ring rather hollow.
Biden has 4 months left in his presidency. Can he use that time to convince the world's fastest-growing continent that these are more than just well-meaning words? Anita Powell, VOA News, New York.
And 2 quick stories. China's defense ministry on Thursday defended its military drills in airspace and maritime areas around Taiwan, saying they were legitimate and that they would continue to strengthen combat readiness and organize such exercises. However, Taiwan's defense ministry expressed alarm about a renewed surge of Chinese military activity around the island and the live-fire drills, accusing Beijing of policy instability that presented a serious challenge to its neighbors. And finally, Florida is bracing for the arrival of Hurricane Helene, which is forecast to be a major hurricane when it smashes into the state's panhandle. Officials have issued dire warnings, pleading with residents in coastal areas along the hurricane's path to evacuate ahead of expected catastrophic winds and a potentially deadly storm surge. And that wraps up today's program. But of course, there's more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across all of our social media platforms. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, I thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Steve Miller. For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.